Imagine a time when the world spoke with one voice. Not accents, not dialects, not translations whispered through headphones or tapped into phones, but one shared language rolling across valleys and deserts like a single heartbeat. Words meant the same thing to everyone. Commands were understood instantly. Stories were never lost in translation. And in that fragile moment of unity, humanity believed it had finally discovered its greatest power. Togetherness felt infinite. Confidence felt eternal. And so, in the land of Shinar, under an open sky that seemed close enough to touch, an idea was born that would change human history forever. What if we built something so tall, so undeniable, so close to the heavens that even God Himself would have to notice us? What if we carved our place into eternity not through humility, but through height? The Tower of Babel was not just bricks stacked on bricks. It was ambition given shape. It was humanity standing shoulder to shoulder and saying, "We will not be scattered. We will not be forgotten. We will make a name for ourselves." This wasn't merely architecture, it was identity under construction. Every brick carried more than clay and bitumen. It carried fear. Fear of insignificance. Fear of being divided. Fear of being small in a vast universe. And in a strange twist, the tower wasn't built to escape God, but to protect humanity from being separated from one another. They believed unity meant safety, and height meant power. They believed that if they stayed together long enough, worked hard enough, reached high enough, nothing could stop them. What makes this story unsettling is how familiar it feels. Thousands of years later, we still build towers. Not always from stone, but from technology, ideology, influence, social media empires, financial systems, and digital identities. We still want to be seen. We still want to be remembered. We still fear being scattered, irrelevant, unheard. And just like Babel, our greatest achievements often begin with noble intentions before slowly transforming into monuments of pride. The people of Babel didn't wake up thinking they were rebelling against heaven. They woke up believing they were securing their future. According to Book of Genesis, humanity's unified language was both a gift and a danger. With no barriers to communication, there were no barriers to ambition. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them, the text suggests. That line alone should make us pause. Not because human potential is evil, but because unchecked potential without wisdom becomes destructive. The problem wasn't collaboration. The problem was direction. Unity without humility becomes tyranny. Progress without purpose becomes chaos. When everyone moves together toward the wrong goal, the collapse is faster and louder. Then comes the moment that echoes through history. God does not destroy the tower. He does not strike it down with fire or flood. Instead, something far more subtle happens. Language fractures. Words lose their shared meaning. Neighbors suddenly sound like strangers. Instructions fall apart mid-sentence. Confusion spreads faster than fear. The tower doesn't fall because it's attacked. It fails because communication fails. This is one of the most haunting ideas ever recorded. The greatest human project collapses not because of external force, but because people can no longer understand one another. And this is where Babel stops being a story about ancient bricks and becomes a mirror held up to every generation that follows. How many relationships fail not because of hatred, but misunderstanding? How many nations fracture not because of invasion, but miscommunication? How many wars begin because words are twisted, mistranslated, or weaponized? Babel reminds us that language is power, but also responsibility. The same words that build bridges can also burn them. Archaeologists and historians have long debated whether the Tower of Babel was inspired by real structures, possibly Mesopotamian ziggurats that rose step by step toward the sky. These towers were often seen as meeting points between heaven and earth, places where gods descended and humans ascended. What's fascinating is that the tower may not have been meant as an act of war against God, but as an attempt to control the divine. To anchor heaven to human terms. To make the sacred predictable. And isn't that something we still try to do? We package faith, label truth, measure worth, and quantify meaning, all because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. The scattering of languages feels like punishment at first glance, but look closer and it begins to resemble mercy. If humanity had continued united in pride, the damage could have been irreversible. Division slowed progress, but it also preserved freedom. Diversity of language birthed diversity of culture, thought, art, music, philosophy. From Babel's confusion came creativity. From fragmentation came exploration. From scattering came stories. What feels like loss in the moment can become the seed of something far greater than we planned. There's something deeply human about wanting to reach the heavens. We look up instinctively. We dream upward. Skyscrapers, rockets, satellites, virtual worlds, all echo the same ancient longing. To touch something eternal. To prove that we matter. Babel asks a quiet but dangerous question: are we building to glorify life, or to glorify ourselves? Because the difference between the two decides whether a tower becomes a blessing or a warning. And here's the most surprising truth hidden inside this ancient story. God doesn't fear human success. The story doesn't say humanity was too strong. It suggests they were too unified around the wrong purpose. The danger was not height, but hubris. Not achievement, but arrogance. The moment humans said, "We will make a name for ourselves," they unknowingly stepped into fragile territory. When identity is built solely on achievement, collapse is inevitable. Because achievements can fall. Titles fade. Towers crumble. Only meaning endures. In our modern world, Babel has gone digital. Algorithms shape language. Echo chambers distort meaning. We speak constantly, yet understand each other less. We have never been more connected, yet more divided. Billions of voices shouting into the void, hoping to be heard, hoping to matter. Babel wasn't the birth of language diversity alone. It was the birth of misunderstanding. And every time we talk past each other instead of listening, Babel lives again. But the story doesn't end in silence. It ends in movement. Humanity scatters, but humanity survives. Civilizations rise. Languages evolve. Faith adapts. Meaning deepens. And much later, another moment appears in Scripture that quietly reverses Babel's curse. At Pentecost, people hear the same message in their own languages. Not by erasing diversity, but by honoring it. Unity without uniformity. Understanding without domination. It's as if history whispers, the solution to Babel was never one language, but one love. So maybe the Tower of Babel isn't a warning against building. Maybe it's a warning about why we build. Are we trying to touch heaven out of wonder, or out of insecurity? Are we seeking connection, or control? Are we afraid of being scattered because we've forgotten that growth sometimes requires movement? That meaning sometimes requires letting go? The ruins of Babel, whether literal or symbolic, remind us that the tallest towers are not always the strongest. The most impressive structures are not always the most enduring. And the loudest voices are not always the wisest. True greatness isn't measured by how high we rise, but by how well we understand, how deeply we love, and how humbly we walk. The Tower of Babel stands as a frozen echo in time, asking every generation the same haunting question: what are you building, and who is it really for? And as the dust of Babel settles, the story refuses to stay buried in the past. It breathes, it waits, it follows humanity into every age like a shadow that stretches longer at sunset. Because Babel is not only something that happened, it is something that happens. Every era creates its own tower, convinced that this time will be different, convinced that the bricks are stronger, the plans wiser, the foundations unshakable. We tell ourselves that knowledge will save us, that speed will save us, that power will save us, that being seen will save us. And slowly, quietly, without noticing, we stack one more brick of pride on top of another, hoping the height will drown out the fear inside us. What's haunting is that Babel was built by people who believed deeply in unity. They didn't want chaos. They didn't want war. They didn't want separation. Their mistake wasn't hatred, it was misplaced trust. They trusted the tower more than the truth. They trusted permanence in a world designed for movement. They trusted human brilliance without acknowledging human limits. And limits are not curses. Limits are reminders that we are not alone, that meaning does not come from reaching the sky, but from understanding our place beneath it. Think about how often modern life mirrors this ancient rhythm. We rush to build careers, reputations, followings, legacies, sometimes before we even know who we are. We tell ourselves once the tower is finished, peace will come. Once the numbers rise, rest will follow. Once the applause is loud enough, the silence inside will finally disappear. But Babel whispers back through time, reminding us that unfinished inner work cannot be completed by external success. A tower can be tall and still hollow. Language breaking at Babel was not just about different words, but different meanings. The same sound suddenly carried different intentions. Cooperation dissolved into confusion. And isn't that the deepest fracture of our age? We speak the same words, but mean different things. Freedom, truth, love, faith, success, all shared words, yet rarely shared understanding. Babel lives wherever listening stops and shouting begins. Babel survives wherever being right matters more than being human. Yet even here, the story is not cruel. It is corrective. The scattering was painful, but it was also protective. It slowed humanity down long enough to rediscover dependence, humility, and wonder. It forced people to travel, to adapt, to encounter the unfamiliar. It birthed nations, languages, music, poetry, cuisine, stories that would never have existed in a single, unbroken uniformity. What felt like divine disruption became human diversity. And maybe that is the quiet hope hidden beneath the rubble. That division, when guided by humility, can lead to discovery. That confusion can give birth to curiosity. That scattering can become expansion. Babel teaches us that unity is not erased by diversity, but deepened by it. The problem was never many voices, it was one voice shouting only for itself. Imagine if the builders of Babel had paused. Imagine if someone had asked, "What happens when the tower is finished?" Would they have found peace, or simply started building higher? Would satisfaction have arrived, or only hunger for more? Because ambition, once fed, rarely learns restraint. Babel warns us that without reflection, progress becomes a treadmill, moving endlessly without arriving anywhere meaningful. And still, humanity keeps building. We launch machines beyond the sky, map galaxies, bend atoms, rewrite code, alter genes. Each breakthrough feels like another brick placed carefully toward the heavens. And none of this is evil. Creativity is a gift. Intelligence is a spark. Curiosity is sacred. The danger appears only when creation forgets reverence, when invention forgets responsibility, when progress forgets purpose. The Tower of Babel asks us to look inward before we look upward. To ask why we crave height. To question what silence we are trying to outrun. To recognize that the desire to be remembered is often rooted in the fear of being meaningless. But meaning was never meant to be manufactured. It was meant to be discovered, lived, shared. In the end, Babel did not fail because humans were too small. It failed because they forgot they were more than builders. They were storytellers, caretakers, companions, seekers. And the greatest story humanity can tell is not how high it climbed, but how deeply it learned to understand one another. So the next time we dream of building something that touches the sky, maybe we should also ask how firmly it is rooted in compassion. How open it is to humility. How willing it is to listen. Because towers built only to reach heaven often collapse under their own weight, but lives built on understanding create bridges that outlast stone. And perhaps that is the final echo of Babel, still speaking across centuries, still speaking into our restless age. Not a command to stop building, but an invitation to build differently. To build not for names, but for meaning. Not for height, but for depth. Not to prove our greatness, but to discover our shared humanity. In Babel, people gathered to avoid being scattered, afraid that separation would erase them. In Jesus, people were gathered again, not by fear, but by love. And yet the method was entirely different. Jesus did not erase languages, cultures, or identities. He spoke in parables drawn from everyday life, seeds and soil, bread and water, stories that could cross linguistic and cultural barriers without demanding uniformity. He did not build a tower to be seen from miles away. He built relationships, one heart at a time, often unnoticed, often misunderstood. The life of Jesus Christ can be read as the quiet undoing of Babel's mistake. Babel tried to force unity by sameness. Jesus invited unity through love. Babel trusted bricks and bitumen. Jesus trusted people. Babel believed height would bring closeness to God. Jesus showed that closeness to God is found in humility, service, and compassion. He washed feet instead of stacking stones. He healed the broken instead of fortifying walls. He spoke of a kingdom not built with human hands, but grown like a seed in the soil of the human heart. At Babel, language became confused and people could no longer understand one another. In Jesus, understanding returned, not always through perfect words, but through presence. The sick felt understood without speeches. The outcast felt seen without explanation. The sinner felt forgiven before fully speaking their guilt. Jesus communicated something deeper than grammar. He spoke the language of grace, a language that didn't require translation because it reached beyond intellect and into the soul. And then there is the cross, which stands as the opposite of a tower. A tower rises to display strength. A cross is lifted to display surrender. A tower says, "Look what we have built." A cross says, "Look what love is willing to endure." If Babel was humanity's attempt to climb upward, the cross was God's willingness to descend into suffering. And in that descent, something extraordinary happened. Division began to lose its grip. Walls began to crack. The scattered were invited home, not to a location, but to a relationship. When Jesus spoke of loving enemies, forgiving endlessly, and losing one's life to find it, he was quietly dismantling the logic that built Babel in the first place. He was redefining greatness. Not as height, but as sacrifice. Not as recognition, but as faithfulness. Not as control, but as trust. The builders of Babel feared being forgotten. Jesus showed that even a life poured out in obscurity can echo through eternity. And then comes Pentecost, a moment that feels like Babel finally breathing again, but this time healed. People from many nations, many languages, hearing one message and understanding it in their own tongue. Not confusion, but clarity. Not domination, but inclusion. It is as if God said, "I will not erase your differences. I will meet you within them." Babel scattered people because pride could not hold them together. Jesus gathered people because love could. So when we look back at the Tower of Babel through the lens of Jesus, the story shifts. Babel becomes the question. Jesus becomes the answer. Babel asks, "How do we reach God?" Jesus responds, "God has already reached you." Babel shows us the danger of unity without humility. Jesus shows us the power of humility that creates true unity. And maybe this is why the story still matters so much today. We are still trying to build towers. Towers of success, influence, certainty, validation. We still fear being scattered, forgotten, small. And Jesus still stands quietly among the noise, not pointing to the sky, but pointing to hearts, reminding us that the way up was never the way forward. In the end, Babel teaches us what happens when humanity builds without God. Jesus shows us what happens when God builds within humanity. One ends in confusion. The other begins redemption. One leaves behind unfinished bricks. The other leaves behind changed lives. And between those two stories, stretched across history, is an invitation still waiting to be answered. Will we keep climbing in pride, or will we finally learn to walk in love? And the invitation does not end with belief alone, it continues into imitation. Because Jesus did not merely speak against Babel, he lived its opposite. Every step he took rewrote the blueprint of human ambition. When crowds tried to make him king, he withdrew. When fame followed him, he slipped away. When power was within reach, he chose obedience instead. In a world obsessed with building upward, he knelt downward. In a culture chasing recognition, he embraced obscurity. In a society measuring worth by visibility, he revealed that the most powerful work often happens unseen. Babel teaches us that humanity's instinct is to climb in order to feel secure. Jesus teaches us that security comes not from elevation, but from trust. Trust that we are already seen, already known, already loved. The builders of Babel feared scattering because they believed separation meant loss. Jesus willingly scattered his followers across nations, knowing that love multiplied through movement would reach farther than any tower ever could. And it did. Not through force, not through fear, but through transformed lives quietly carrying hope into unfamiliar places. What's striking is that Jesus never asked people to abandon their language, culture, or identity to follow him. Fishermen remained fishermen. Tax collectors remained sharp-minded. Women, foreigners, the overlooked were not erased into sameness, but elevated in dignity. This was unity without uniformity, something Babel could never achieve. Babel demanded one voice to protect control. Jesus welcomed many voices to reflect grace. Babel centralized power. Jesus decentralized love. And perhaps the most radical difference lies here. Babel was built to avoid death, to create permanence through structure. Jesus walked directly into death, and in doing so, created permanence through resurrection. Towers crumble. Empires fall. Names fade. But a life laid down in love continues to speak long after stone has turned to dust. This is why the cross still stands when Babel is remembered only as a warning. One was built to preserve self. The other was embraced to save others. Every generation faces this same crossroads, whether we name it or not. We can keep stacking bricks of ego, achievement, and self-made identity, hoping height will save us. Or we can choose the slower, quieter path Jesus modeled, building lives rooted in compassion, forgiveness, humility, and truth. One path promises visibility. The other promises transformation. One path creates monuments. The other creates meaning. And maybe this is why the story of Babel still unsettles us. Because deep down, we recognize its impulse within ourselves. The desire to be invulnerable. The fear of being forgotten. The hunger to matter. Jesus does not shame that hunger. He redirects it. He reminds us that our value was never meant to be constructed brick by brick. It was spoken into existence before we ever lifted a stone. We were not created to prove our worth, but to live from it. So when the noise of the world grows louder, when voices clash and understanding feels distant, when we feel tempted to build our own tower just to feel safe, the story gently pulls us back. Back to the carpenter who built no towers, wrote no books, commanded no armies, yet reshaped history more profoundly than any empire ever could. Back to the truth that the way to heaven was never a staircase of human effort, but a path of divine love walking toward us. In the end, Babel shows us what happens when humanity tries to rise without God. Jesus shows us what happens when God chooses to walk with humanity. One leads to confusion. The other leads to communion. One scatters hearts. The other gathers them. And the question that remains is not ancient at all, it is painfully modern and deeply personal. What are we building our lives on, and who are we building them for? Because the tallest tower cannot save us from ourselves, but a humble heart, shaped by love, can become a dwelling place for something eternal. And when this ancient story is carried fully into the modern world, it stops feeling symbolic and starts feeling unsettlingly accurate. Today, our towers are no longer made of stone, but of screens, data, influence, algorithms, skyscrapers of glass, timelines that never sleep, platforms that promise connection yet quietly monetize attention. We speak constantly, post endlessly, comment instantly, yet somehow understanding feels rarer than ever. Never before has humanity shared so many words while listening so little. Never before have we been so globally connected and yet so emotionally fragmented. This is Babel wearing a digital face. We build online identities brick by brick, likes by likes, followers by followers, hoping visibility will translate into value. We measure worth in metrics, success in reach, truth in virality. And just like Babel, the intention is not always evil. People want to belong. People want to matter. People fear disappearing into silence. So we build higher profiles, louder opinions, stronger personal brands, convinced that if we stay visible, we will stay safe. But the higher the tower rises, the more fragile it becomes. One misunderstanding, one misinterpreted word, one viral moment, and the structure shakes. Language, once again, is at the center. Words move faster than wisdom. Meaning is reduced to slogans. Context collapses. Conversations become competitions. People speak the same language yet live in completely different realities. Truth fractures into versions. Facts dissolve into narratives. And confusion spreads not because we lack information, but because we are drowning in it. Babel didn't require silence to fail. It failed amid noise. And so do we. In politics, in culture, in religion, in social spaces, everyone is building something they believe will save them. Ideologies become towers. Nationalism becomes a tower. Technology becomes a tower. Even spirituality can become a tower when it's used to elevate the self instead of transform the heart. We say we want unity, but only on our terms. We say we want peace, but without surrender. We say we want understanding, but without listening. Babel thrives wherever control masquerades as clarity. And this is exactly why the way of Jesus feels so disruptive in the modern world. He doesn't offer a bigger tower. He offers a different foundation. In an age obsessed with being heard, he teaches the power of listening. In a culture addicted to self-promotion, he models self-giving. In a world that cancels, divides, labels, and discards, he restores, reconciles, and redeems. He does not shout over the noise, he steps into it and speaks with clarity that cuts through confusion. Jesus in the modern world would still walk among the overlooked. He would still touch the untouchable. He would still unsettle the comfortable and comfort the unsettled. He would not build a platform to go viral, yet his words would travel farther than any algorithm. Because truth spoken with love always outlives trends. Babel relies on momentum. Jesus relies on transformation. And maybe this is the question our age is avoiding. Not how fast we can build, but why we are building at all. Are we constructing systems that protect our ego, or spaces that protect our humanity? Are we speaking to dominate, or to understand? Are we climbing to be seen, or kneeling to truly see others? The modern world doesn't need fewer builders. It needs wiser ones. Builders who know when to pause. Who know when to listen. Who know that unity forced through power always fractures, but unity formed through humility can hold even under pressure. Babel collapsed because it tried to hold humanity together through fear. Jesus gathers humanity through love. And perhaps the most hopeful truth is this: the modern world is not beyond redemption. Confusion is not the end of the story. Division is not the final word. Babel reminds us how easily things can fall apart. Jesus reminds us how beautifully they can be put back together. Not by erasing differences, but by teaching us how to live with them. Not by climbing higher, but by going deeper. So here we stand, in a world of endless construction, holding ancient bricks in modern hands. And the question echoes louder than ever, not from heaven, but from within us: will we keep building towers to protect our fear, or will we finally build lives rooted in love, truth, and humility? Because history has already shown us what towers can do. And it has also shown us what one life, lived fully in love, can change forever. And as this story slowly settles into your heart, let it leave you with something more than information. Let it leave you with reflection. The Tower of Babel reminds us how easy it is to build something impressive and still feel empty. Jesus reminds us how powerful it is to live humbly and still change the world. Between those two paths stands every one of us, every day, choosing what kind of life we are building, what kind of words we are speaking, and what kind of love we are leaving behind. If this message stirred something inside you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see the world just a little differently, then this story has done its job. And if you believe more people need reminders like this in a noisy, divided world, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video so it can reach hearts searching for meaning. Share it with someone who might need hope, clarity, or quiet strength today. And subscribe to this channel, because here we don't just tell stories, we explore truths that help us grow, heal, and understand life more deeply, one moment at a time. Remember this as you step back into your world: you were never meant to build towers to prove your worth. You were meant to build bridges through understanding, kindness, and love. Keep questioning, keep learning, keep choosing humility over pride and connection over confusion. And until we meet again, may your life be built not on fear of being forgotten, but on the courage to love deeply and live meaningfully.